Welcome to the latest episode of the Small Triumph Sports Library and Archives channel. I believe, based on assurances I made at the end of the last video, that I'm supposed to be at least temporarily pivoting away from the tedious details of documents and artifacts and moving toward a little more content that is specifically about the cars and about my projects. However, I have to get back to some tedious details in this episode. Problem is, this is an Errata episode. It is a little bit of cleanup work related to episode 15. That was my fuse box episode. I worked quite hard on that, but at the end of the process, I decided to tack on a little segment about the fuses that Triumph specified for late Spitfire fuse boxes, and I turned out to be wrong. Before I get to the correction part, though, we're going to flash back to when I was wrong. And just a word of caution, don't trust this guy you're about to watch. Before I close this video, though, I do want to talk about one more fuse box related issue that it's a curiosity. It's of interest to me. And this actually has to do with this particular Triumph Spitfire 1500 owner's handbook. And I'll note that this is one of the most frequently reprinted handbooks. My copy that I'm showing you here is a reprint that I bought from a vendor probably 20 or 25 years ago. This is the one for the 1978 and early 1979 models. And it includes fuse box information that's different from the information that I have seen in really any other Spitfire or GT6 workshop manual or owner's manual or maintenance handbook. So this particular owner's handbook talks about the circuits in the fuse box, and you can see there that it says the top fuse in the fuse box, and this is of course the Lucas 8FJ fuse box. The top fuse should be 35 amp. The middle fuse here, it says, should be 10 amp, and then the bottom fuse should be 35 amp. Every other book that I've seen, factory or almost otherwise, have emphasized that the fuses in the fuse box should all be 35 amp. And I have to feel like this is an error, but it's an important error because this discussion of the fuse box is actually the one that's reproduced in the Bentley manual. So the Bentley manual has an owner's handbook section in it. And the Bentley manual emphasizes that it is a compilation of driver's handbooks and maintenance handbooks for model years 1975 through 1980 that they are presenting in the owner's handbook section. But this exact information is reproduced in the Bentley manual. Now, people far smarter than I am with electrical issues say that that circuit, that middle circuit, doesn't really require any more than a 10 amp fuse. And that may very well be true. If a 10 amp fuse works there, that's fine. But I still think this is an error because if you look at the February 1981 issued Triumph Spitfire 1500 factory parts catalog, which covers the cars from 1975 through 1980, you will see that the only fuse listed for the fuse box is GFS 435, which when you look at the parts list is a 35 amp fuse. And interestingly, if you just look at that particular section of the catalog, they don't even list a 10 amp fuse at all. It's a 15 amp fuse, a 20 amp fuse, and a 35 amp fuse. So My understanding has always been that all three of the fuses in the Lucas 8FJ fuse box should be a 35 amp fuse. And again, that is UK British Lucas rated 35 amp fuse. But I did want to point out that we do have at least one factory publication that suggests 10 amps for the middle fuse. And again, in my opinion, that is an error, but it may be a functional error based on what I've heard from folks. When I recorded that add-on to my Fusebox video, I was working not exclusively, but primarily from two books that I had on my shelf. The first is this one, which is, of course, the Triumph Spitfire 1500 Owner's Handbook. This is the U.S. Market Owner's Handbook. It is a reprint of the 1978 through early 1979 Owner's Handbook. I'm confident that it's a reprint because in the back pages, where an original includes publication information, it's blank back here, but there actually is no indication in here that it is a Brooklands Books reprint, but I'm confident that it is. One thing I did not know, and I hadn't paid a lot of attention to, I didn't realize that basically all the U.S. market owners' handbooks look like this superficially with the rose-colored cover and everything else. From about 1974-ish all the way through 1979 and a half. So the owner's handbook superficially all look the same. For the UK market, I think the cover looks exactly like this, but it's blue. At least that's what I've seen so far. Don't necessarily take that to the bank, but that's my understanding. The other book that I worked primarily from is this one. This, of course, is the Robert Bentley Complete Official Triumph Spitfire 1500, 1975 to 1980. And this book includes a mashup of different owner's handbooks and factory workshop manuals from between the years 1975 and 1980. So what happened when I was discussing this 10 amp middle fuse issue is that I assumed that this 1978 through early 1979 owner's handbook had fuse box information that was a one-off that then was reprinted in the Bentley. Turns out I was wrong about that. And let me explain. So I felt good about my conjecture that the prescription for a 10 amp middle fuse in the 1978 and early 1979 Spitfire Owner's Handbook was an error. And I felt good about it based on the evidence that I had on hand, and especially, as I pointed out in my Fusebox video, the fact that the Spitfire factory parts catalog does not seem to have associated a 10 amp fuse with the Spitfire fuse box all the way through the end of the run. And in fact, the Spitfire factory parts catalog does not seem to have listed a 10 amp fuse anywhere all the way through the end of the run. So based on all the evidence that I had at hand, I felt like that was, a one-off. It had made it into the Bentley, but it was probably an error of some kind that had just kind of gotten out there and was, based on the evidence I had, disseminated in a very limited way. However, something happened to change my mind. As I continued to collect period documents, one of the things that I wanted to do was collect some later Lucas catalogs. I mentioned in my Fusebox video that I have a fairly large and fairly complete collection of Lucas Triumph service and specifications catalogs going back to the 1950s through 1973, which I believe is the point at which Lucas stopped producing those kinds of mark-specific catalogs. But I didn't have any Lucas catalogs covering the years 1974 through 1981. And of course, as I've discussed a lot on this channel, I have a 1980 Spitfire, so I didn't have any Lucas catalogs related specifically to that particular car. So as I was looking for various books and documents to potentially purchase, I'm always on the lookout to find something interesting that's affordable, it's worth adding to my library. And I found this Lucas Service catalog. It's really a supplement. It was published in January of 1983, and it covers British imports from 1977 to 1983. And I purchased it and I got it in the mail. I didn't really expect anything, shocking or especially interesting in it. I was just adding it to my collection. But when I got it, I opened it up and I was looking in the Spitfire section. And sure enough, under Fusebox, which, by the way, it says 1977 to 79, and I have no idea why it doesn't say 77 to 80 on the Fusebox itself. I'm going to assume that is just an error. The 79 wasn't updated to 80 for whatever reason on that line. But what's interesting for our purposes is the fact that we have two different fuses associated with the Fusebox, a 10 amp fuse and a 35 amp fuse. This was surprising to me. I didn't expect it. And now all of a sudden I had a Lucas catalog that seemed to confirm what I had seen in that late Spitfire 1500 owner's handbook, the 78 to early 79 owner's handbook, saying that you should use a 10 amp middle fuse. So now I had to rethink everything. Maybe it wasn't an error. Clearly Lucas was aware that a 10 amp fuse should be associated with the fuse box, at least by 1983. Another Lucas catalog I picked up around the same time is this British Car Replacement Parts 1965 through 1976. You can see down there on the bottom, it was published in October of 1976. And there really isn't any useful information in this particular catalog for our purposes. In the Spitfire section, if the fuse box is listed, but no fuses are associated with the fuse box. And in fact, if you go to the fuse box section of this catalog, the 8FJ fuse box is there, but no fuses are associated with the fuse box, which is a little odd. You can see just above that, some of the other fuse boxes do have fuses associated with them, but the 8FJ does not in this catalog. So this particular Lucas catalog doesn't provide any additional information. So at this point, all that I know is that I have an owner's handbook that is 1978 owner's handbook covering through early 1979 model year. And that owner's handbook says that you should use a 10 amp fuse for the middle circuit. I thought it was a mistake, but now I see a 10 amp fuse in a Lucas service catalog associated with the Spitfire fuse box. So clearly Lucas was aware that a 10 amp fuse is associated with the Spitfire fuse box. So now I'm starting to think very differently about this. I've gone from thinking, oh, this was a one-off error in one owner's handbook that then got disseminated out a little bit, to thinking, well, maybe it really was intentional, and I had to think about when this switch was made. I was at a loss at this point, so I did what you might expect I'd do. I went out into the online Triumph community and started to ask around. And I was specifically interested to see what earlier versions of the owner's handbook said, especially 74, 75, 76, 77 model years. I was very curious about what they said. I also asked if anybody was aware of any technical service bulletins related to this change. Might help us pin down when it happened. There are some technical service bulletins that are available online. They were once housed on a different site, but they're currently on the Triumph Spitfire and GT6 information warehouse website, but they only cover through 73 or 74. I have picked up and purchased the 1978 Technical Service Bulletins and the 1980 Technical Service Bulletins, but both of those are too late for our purposes here in terms of discovering when Triumph made this change. I would have guessed that from the outset, and that has turned out to be true. There's nothing on that, and it may very well be that no technical service bulletins were ever offered about this change. But when I asked around online, I had one fellow enthusiast who said he had a 1977 model year owner's handbook. And these are the pictures that were shared. And you can see there, it doesn't say for the 1977 model year on there, but you can see the /77 after the part number. And this is a first edition. On the back page, and this is pretty surprising, but on the back page, we learned that this 1977 model year owner's handbook was actually published in December of 1975, which seems really early for a 1977 model year owner's handbook. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but that seems to be the publication date. And the important thing here is that the fuse box information in this 1977 model year owner's handbook is the exact same as what I showed for the 78, early 79 owner's handbook. It prescribes a 10 amp middle fuse. So this is that same information, although this is as it appears in the 78, early 79 owner's handbook. But you can see how it's set up. The circuits are listed. The top circuit says the 35 amp fuse fed by blah, blah, blah. The second one for the middle circuit says the 10 amp fuse, blah, blah, blah. And then the bottom one, the 35 amp fuse fed by blah, blah, blah. What I learned based on this information supplied by a fellow Triumph enthusiast online is that Triumph had begun prescribing the 10 amp middle fuse at the very least by the 1977 model year, and that the change had been made by December of 1975, which is when that 1977 model year handbook was published. I had speculated when I initially went out online and began asking questions that the fuse was changed for the middle circuit based on the introduction of the dimmer for the instrument lights in around 1975. And, simply circumstantial evidence really surrounding that. But I looked at what was on all the circuits, and I noticed that instrument illumination is on that middle circuit. And I knew that dimmer was introduced at some point in the mid-1970s. And, so it just made sense to me that maybe some kind of problem or some caution about introducing the dimmer into that circuit had led to the change in the fuse that Triumph wanted you to use for that middle circuit. We kicked that around some online. I think there is something to that theory, but I'm not an electrical expert overall. And what I was mainly trying to do is find out if anybody had any owner's handbooks that were earlier than the 77 model year, because I'm trying to get documents in order to pin down when Triumph actually made this change. And nobody else was able to chime in with anything. But at my local car club's annual car show last weekend, the Coventry Foundation was there with a little tent and display, and they were selling books for very reasonable prices. And among those books were some original factory publications. And one of the things that I was able to pick up is this, which is the Triumph Spitfire 1500 Owner's Handbook for the 1975 model year. I had no idea what I would discover when I took the time to look through this carefully, but I was hoping that it would shed some light on, when the change to the 10 amp middle fuse was made. So this particular owner's handbook, you can see it is for the 1975 model year. You've got the /75 after the part number. Curiously, this was published later than you would expect for a first edition owner's handbook for the 1975 model year. It was published in June of 1975. And this is really curious because now we have a June 1975 75 model year owner's handbook, and then we have a December 1975 1977 model year handbook. And it makes you wonder when in the world handbooks were published for the 76 model year. However, it could very well be that the 75 and 77 were used to cover the 76 model year. I don't know for sure. I don't have access to enough different owners' handbooks to be able to say a whole lot about that, but it is curious. Regardless, this is a handbook for the 1975 model year. It's indicated to be first edition, and it was published in June of 1975. And now we get to the important part, because the fuse box section is different in this owner's handbook. You can see there at the top of the page in the electrical section, we have fuse information given, and it is a 35 amp fuse that is listed there. And then under circuits, we don't get different amperage indicated for each circuit. Each circuit simply says the fuse fed by, the fuse fed by, the fuse fed by. So it's very clear that this 1975 model year owner's handbook is prescribing a 35 amp fuse for all three circuits, which is what had traditionally been the case for the Spitfire and GT6 after the introduction of the 8FJ fuse box. So now we know that the change to the 10 amp middle fuse happened at some point between June of 1975 and December of 1975, and the change seems to have been specific to the 1977 model year. A curiosity about that, though, is that in both of these rose-colored U.S. market owner's handbooks that I have in my possession, that is both the 1975 model year one and the 1978, early 1979 model year one, when you look at the specs in the back of the book, under electrical system, both of them only indicate a 35 amp fuse. And again, somebody took the decision to go to a 10 amp middle fuse. There had to be a rationale behind it, but it was not rolled out effectively. So once the change is made in the owner's handbook, the specs at the back of the owner's handbook aren't changed. The factory parts catalog does not seem to be changed. There's no reference to this change in the factory workshop manuals that I've seen. It's just, obviously the decision was taken to make that change, but it was not rolled out consistently through all of the appropriate Triumph documents and publications. So the story's not over. I need to look at more documents, and I need to see if there are any other documents out there, especially factory documents, but perhaps Lucas documents as well, that shed any light on this before I try to offer a more definitive narrative. I've already screwed this up once, so I'm going to be cautious about screwing it up again. But just to quickly recap, so U.S. market owners handbooks, and by the way, I don't know what UK market owners handbooks may say. Any of you out there, especially those of you in the UK, have any information to share, I'd appreciate it. There are a number of U.S. market owners handbooks that I have not looked at. So if any of you can fill in any of these gaps, I'd appreciate it. But I've not, for example, looked at a 1974 model year owner's handbook. I assume it's the same as the 75 that I have, but I don't know that for sure. I don't know if there was a 1976 model year owner's handbook based on the information I've shared in this video, but we do have that very useful information that owner's handbook published in June of 75 says 35 amp fuses for all three circuits, and 1977 published in December of 1975 has 10 amp middle fuse. So we do have that window in late 75 where the change seems to have been made, and that's useful. The other thing I wanted to mention is the books that come with the card change completely with the introduction of the so-called rubber bumper cars. So the 79.5 model year came with 2 books. They're blue. The covers of them are blue, but there's an owner's handbook and a maintenance handbook. And then the 1980 has a kind of dark olive green colored set of books, owner's handbook and a maintenance handbook. I've been through both of those books for both 79.5 and 1980 model years, and I do not see any specific fuse information provided in those books. The electrical section simply says to, if a circuit goes out, to, just replace the fuse, but it's not specific about, the fuse ratings. I do not have a lot of later Lucas parts catalogs. So the post 1973, I don't have a lot to work with. I've covered the 2 catalogs that I have. It is that 1977 to 1983 supplement that indicates or associates a 10 amp fuse with the Spitfire fuse box that really, sent me in this direction to doing all of this additional research to try to pin things down. Factory parts catalogs, as I indicated in my fuse box video, factory parts catalogs do not say anything about a 10 amp fuse. They don't seem to associate a 10 amp fuse with the fuse box at all the way through the end of the run, unless I've missed something. In fact, unless I've missed something, there aren't even 10 amp fuses listed in the factory parts catalog at all. The factory workshop manuals, I have the Bentley, and I recently picked up an original 1977 Spitfire 1500 factory workshop manual. I don't see any prescriptions for the fuse box fuses in any of those. So I don't think there's anything much there. Technical service bulletins. I have not seen any fuse box related service bulletins issued by Triumph. There is that collection of technical service bulletins that covers through roughly 1973, 1974. That is now hosted on the Triumph Spitfire and GT6 Information Warehouse website, but there's nothing fuse box related on there. Later technical service bulletins I don't have access to. I do own the 78 and 1980 British Leyland /JRT technical service bulletin books, but they don't have anything fuse box related in them. And of course 78 and 80 are really too late for this. It looks like the change was made in 1975 based on the evidence that we have. So I'd expect to see something in the technical service bulletins book around 75, 76, but there may not be anything there at all. Part of the reason I think there may have never been a technical service bulletin issued about this is that Mike Cook, in his book, The Triumph Spitfire, in Appendix A, actually includes a summary of service bulletins, and it's probably not comprehensive, but nevertheless, there is nothing fuse box related mentioned in that summary. So I suspect there may not be anything out there, but I'd like to turn over every leaf to give us a chance to pin this down better if we can. So I've probably set a new low for being exceedingly boring. Perhaps this video will be of some use to people out there who have been struggling to fall asleep at night or something like that. I do think that this is an interesting and potentially important issue, and it's one that I've not seen anybody dig into in this way before. But I also realize that not everybody wants to follow me into the weeds on these kinds of tedious details. And if you don't, you've almost certainly stopped watching a long time ago. And so I'm obviously not speaking to you. I have been extremely busy at work, so I have not had time to work on content. As usual, I have several different videos that I've been collecting material for a while that are in the works, and I've struggled to get to them. But in a few weeks, the summer will start to open up. That means more time working on my cars and more time working on videos. And I promise I have some videos that are a little more car specific and a little less book nerdy coming up soon. So thanks for watching. If you're still watching, thank you for hanging in there with me, and I hope to be back soon.